Being a blacksmith in the Middle Ages may sound like a thrilling job, working with fire, shaping metal, and crafting swords. But the reality was nothing like the stories you've heard. It was tough, grueling, and filled with problems no one ever talks about. If you had to live that life, you'd probably regret it by the end of day one. In medieval times, you didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a blacksmith because it seemed cool. There were no career counselors guiding you to follow your passion. For most blacksmiths, the decision was made out of interest or a sudden urge. It was often made before you could even walk. If your father hammered metal for a living, well, guess what? You were going to hammer metal too. Family trades were passed down like unwanted heirlooms, and blacksmithing was no exception. By the time you were 5 or 6 years old, most future blacksmiths were already hauling coal and pumping the bellows. Your first piggyback ride wasn't on your dad's shoulders, it was on an anvil. Training started brutally young, and while other kids were playing with sticks and rocks, young smiths were learning how not to lose fingers. Your mentor was usually your father or uncle, who had learned the hard way and thought you should too. Mistakes weren't opportunities for learning, they were chances for yelling. Did the metal burn you? Good, now you won't do that again. Medieval blacksmithing training had no safety rules, breaks, or concern for child development. An 8-year-old could easily work 10 hours straight during busy seasons. If your arms weren't strong enough to lift the hammer, tough luck. You kept going until you could, or until you passed out from exhaustion. Records from the 1300s showed that some apprentice blacksmiths started as young as 7 years old, and formal apprenticeships could last anywhere from 7 to 10 years. This means that by the time you were 17, you'd have put in 10,000 hours of metalwork. Your back would already be starting to curve, your hands would be permanently calloused, and your lungs damaged from all the smoke. The medieval guild system did offer some structure, but it also locked you into a strict hierarchy. Breaking rank or trying to switch careers? Good luck. The system wasn't designed for social mobility. It was built to maintain the status quo. While today's teenagers stress about choosing their college major, medieval teens were already experts in a trade they never chose, with skills they couldn't escape. Your career path was a straight line from your cradle to your anvil, with no option for escape. Job security, you never asked for. As tough as training was, at least you got to work in comfortable conditions, right? Unfortunately, no. Imagine spending 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, standing next to what could essentially be called a small volcano. The forge wasn't just hot, it was hellish. A typical blacksmithing forge needed to reach temperatures between 1,500 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit to properly work iron. For context, that's hot enough to melt aluminum, lead, and zinc. To put it in perspective, that's roughly 8 to 10 times hotter than the hottest day ever recorded on Earth. Your workplace would make Death Valley look like a refrigerator. Summer months were particularly brutal. Picture yourself hammering away next to a roaring fire, when it's already 85 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Medieval smiths didn't have moisture-wicking shirts or cooling towels. They had wool, linen, or nothing at all. Many worked shirtless, and they still suffered from heat exhaustion regularly. Archaeological evidence from medieval smithies shows that forge floors were often slightly sloped with drainage channels. Why? Because blacksmiths sweated so much that the floors had to be drained to manage the sweat. Some accounts suggest that on particularly hot days, a busy smith might lose several pounds of water weight in a single work shift. Winter didn't bring any real relief either. The extreme contrast between the intense heat of the forge and the freezing air outside created a perfect storm for illness. Your front would roast while your back froze. Touch your tools with bare hands. Enjoy the sensation of your skin sticking to freezing metal before you instantly burned as you turn back to the forge. Medieval blacksmiths were the original human hot pockets. Frozen on one side, scorching on the other, the constant temperature fluctuations led to chronic health problems. Records from medieval guild documents mention forge fever, a condition where smiths would suffer from recurring chills, sweats, and respiratory issues due to the constant hot-cold cycles. Their immune systems weakened over time, leaving them vulnerable to whatever plague or pox was going around. And ventilation. Forget about it. Early smithies were often built to trap heat, not release it. Smoke, fumes, and heat collected under low ceilings. The best climate control you could get was opening a door, which of course led to problematic drafts that could affect the temperature of the forge. Water was the only cooling mechanism, and smiths drank constantly, dunked their heads when possible, and still ended their shifts looking like they'd been caught in a rainstorm. But of course it wasn't rain, it was all sweat. But the heat was just the beginning of your problems. The modern world offers ergonomic handles, safety guards, and lightweight alloys. Medieval blacksmiths had none of these luxuries. Their tools were heavy, crude, and completely indifferent to human comfort. Let's start with the hammer, a blacksmith's constant companion. A typical smith's hammer weighed between 2 and 5 pounds. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Try swinging it thousands of times a day. A busy blacksmith could make hundreds of nails a day, with each nail requiring at least 20 strikes. That's potentially tens of thousands of pounds lifted every single day. Your arm wouldn't just get tired, it would develop its own personality, its own grudges. Archaeological findings from medieval smithies show evidence of repetitive stress injuries in skeletal remains. Blacksmiths often had enlarged bone attachments, or muscles connected to their dominant arm and shoulder, and compressed vertebrae from years of hunching over the anvil. The anvil itself weighed anywhere from 100 to 200 pounds and offered no forgiveness for mistakes. If your hammer glanced off the metal, the rebound could break your wrist. Many smiths had distinctive scars across their hands and forearms from such accidents. The cruelest part, when your tools broke, you couldn't just order replacements. You had to make new ones yourself, using your broken tools. Imagine trying to make new tongs while holding hot metal with the broken tongs you were trying to replace. It was a chicken and egg problem. Tongs were particularly problematic. Made from the same iron as the workpieces, they could warp or break during use. If your tongs failed while holding a piece of red-hot metal, you had two terrible options: drop your work and lose hours of effort, or risk severe burns trying to save it. It was like playing hot potato. Except the potato was 1-800 degrees Fahrenheit, and your livelihood depended on not dropping it. Tool maintenance took hours of precious time. After a long day making items for customers, you had to repair and maintain your own equipment. Smiths, who made weapons and armor for soldiers, rarely had time to make protective gear for themselves. The physical toll was immense. Smiths' hands became so calloused that feeling in their fingertips diminished. Not great when your job requires precision. Many developed permanent hearing damage from the constant hammering, and their eyes suffered from flying metal fragments and the forge's glare. Now, if the physical punishment wasn't enough, dealing with customers could be even worse. You'd think people would appreciate someone who could literally shape metal with fire and strength. You'd be wrong. Medieval customers were the original Karens of history. First, there was the urgency problem. Everyone thought their order was the most important. Farmers needed their plow fixed before planting season. Soldiers needed their sword sharpened before battle. Merchants needed wagon repairs before the next market day. Everyone acted like their iron needs had been sent directly from the heavens. Historical records from guild complaints show that blacksmiths were often threatened by impatient customers. One document from 15th century London mentions a blacksmith being held at dagger point until he finished shoeing a nobleman's horse. While the nobleman was already late for a hunting party, payment was another headache. Medieval economies, especially in rural areas, didn't operate on cash. They ran mostly on barter. That meant blacksmiths often received payment in goods rather than coins. Need to feed your family? Hope you like turnips, because that's what Farmer John is paying you with today? One record from a 14th century German blacksmith's ledger shows he accepted 3 chickens, a wheel of cheese, and the promise of future hay as payment for a full set of farming tools. Speaking of promises, they were worth less than the air they were spoken on. A "I'll pay you next market day" was medieval code for "catch me if you can." Debt collection was in tea as simple as making a phone call. It meant physically tracking someone. Down in a world without addresses or identification, social hierarchy made things even worse. Nobles and clergy expected priority service and discounts, or sometimes free work for the honor of serving them. Refuse a nobleman's demand, and you might find yourself explaining why to the local lord, or worse, dealing with armed men at your door after dark. Blacksmiths, particularly widows who inherited smithies, faced even worse treatment. Records show that female smiths were often expected to charge less. While dealing with customers who constantly questioned their abilities, the worst customers were the ones who fancied themselves experts. They'd hang around the forge, offering unsolicited advice. My uncle's friend was a blacksmith in the next county, and he always hit the metal harder than that. Nothing improves ironwork like unsolicited advice from someone whose closest experience to metallurgy was burning soup. But at least all this customer harassment resulted in proper payment, right? Well, not really. Today we take payment for granted. You do the work, you get the money. But for medieval blacksmiths, compensation was more of a guessing game. Actual coins were rare in everyday medieval life, especially in rural areas.
Ow.
Most people never held more than a few coins in their entire lives. Instead, the economy ran on barter, credit, and obligations. For blacksmiths, this meant the payment often came in the form of chickens, geese, grain, vegetables, ale, wool, or even labor promises. Your salary wasn't deposited in a bank. It clucked, fermented, or rotted in your yard. This created practical problems. A chicken could run away before you got it home, grain could spoil in bad weather, and how many cabbages could one family eat? The blacksmith essentially became a small-scale trader, bartering goods to get the things they actually needed. The credit system was just as problematic. Many customers kept a tally of their debts on notched sticks or in rudimentary ledgers. Some rural smiths had debts that stretched back decades, and historical records from several European towns show blacksmiths at the top of creditor lists in local wills. That's right, even after their death, people were still owing them for work they'd completed years earlier. Seasonal payment issues made things even worse. Farmers usually paid their debts after harvest, which meant that smiths could go months without significant income, despite working tirelessly. Winter was especially difficult, as everyone needed metal work, but nobody had anything to trade until the spring. And despite being essential to society, blacksmiths rarely became rich. Archaeological evidence shows that urban smiths, who worked for nobility or the military, could accumulate some wealth, but the average rural blacksmith lived modestly. Their homes contained few luxuries, aside from their tools. Tax collectors didn't make things any easier. Blacksmiths were visible, stationary targets for taxation. Their workshops couldn't be hidden, and their incomes were easier to assess than many other professions. Records from several medieval European towns show that blacksmiths were taxed at higher rates than merchants, who actually earned more. Even the payments that seemed reliable weren't always as good as they appeared. The local lord might pay you by reducing your taxes or offering protection to your shop. Protection you never asked for, from threats that might not even exist. It was like a medieval insurance scam, except the gangster had a sword and he owned your house. As if all these financial headaches weren't enough. There was something even more concerning about a blacksmith's daily routine that affected every breath they took. Every job has its hazards, but medieval blacksmiths faced a silent killer with every breath. The air in a smithy wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. With each strike of hot metal, microscopic particles of iron oxide, coal dust, and metals would fly into the air. Without respiratory protection, blacksmiths inhaled this toxic cocktail day in and day out. Their nostrils were essentially the world's first unfiltered vacuum cleaners, sucking up everything the forge produced. The charcoal or coal used to heat the forge released carbon monoxide, a colorless, odorless gas that slowly poisoned the smith. In small workshops, this exposure caused headaches, dizziness, and confusion. Symptoms were often dismissed as simple tiredness. Is the room spinning, or is it just Monday? That was a common joke among smiths, except no one was laughing by the end of the week. When working with lead or copper alloys, metal fumes were even worse. Smiths inhaled vapors that damaged their nervous systems, and their bodies became like metal banks, where deposits went in but never out. Blacksmiths often died younger than other tradespeople. One study of burial records from a 14th century English town revealed that the average age of death for blacksmiths was 47, compared to 59 for tailors and 62 for clergy. The clergy prayed for heaven, but blacksmiths got early admission tickets. Most smiths knew that something in their work was making them sick. They could see how older masters struggled to breathe, and how apprentices developed persistent coughs that never seemed to go away. Some tried tying cloths around their faces to filter out some of the harmful particles, but these crude masks did little to protect them from the most dangerous dust. Breathing problems were just one of the daily struggles. Medieval blacksmith shops wouldn't pass a single modern safety inspection. There were no warning signs, no guardrails, and no protective equipment. It was just hot metal, sharp tools, and human flesh. The only safety feature was your reflexes, and those got slower with each mug of ale after work. Burns were the most common injuries. These weren't minor singes. We're talking about serious burns from metal heated too. Over 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the typical blacksmith's arms bore a map of scars from decades of clothes, counters with hot iron. If modern tattoos tell life stories, medieval smiths had their autobiographies written in scar tissue. A medical text from the 1300s describes a treatment specifically for blacksmith's burns. A mixture of egg whites, honey, and herbs applied to the wound, then wrapped in clean linen. But most of the time, smiths just kept working through the pain. Does it hurt when you do that? Yes. Then keep doing it. We need 50 more nails by sundown. Metal fragments were another constant threat. Without eye protection, many smiths suffered vision damage or even blindness from these flying projectiles. Their eye for detail sometimes came at the cost of the eye itself. When injuries happened, medical care was primitive at best. Serious wounds often became infected, leading to blood poisoning, and amputation was sometimes the only treatment. The blacksmith would be operated on using the same forge to heat the blade for cauterizing the wound. No anesthesia involved. Many smiths developed their own folk remedies. Special salves for burns that were closely guarded family secrets passed down alongside the forging techniques. As if the physical dangers weren't enough, there was another bitter reality about the blacksmith's profession. The gleaming suits of armor worn by knights and shining plate armor represented countless hours of a blacksmith's labor, hours spent creating protective gear for others, while remaining vulnerable themselves. The knights walking metal treasures were protected from head to toe, while the smith, who made that protection, wore nothing but a leather apron, surrounded by flying metal fragments and scorching heat. Crafting a single suit of plate armor could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months of daily work. Each piece had to be precisely shaped, fitted, and articulated. But knights needed to look shiny at tournaments. Typical breastplate required dozens of heating cycles. With the smith manipulating heavy metal that was hot enough to burn through flesh instantly, a retirement age, a blacksmith's dominant arm could qualify as its own weapon. The irony was thick. Knights expected their armor to fit perfectly. Too loose, and it wouldn't protect properly. It's too tight, and they couldn't move in battle. And of course, they'd complain about a tiny gap in their armor while safely standing in the smithy. Completely unaware of the smith who had just burned off half an eyebrow to make the rest fit perfectly. A full suit of custom plate armor could cost as much as a small farm, which meant the armorer was creating something he could never afford to own himself. While the knight rode into battle, fully protected from head to toe, the smith who crafted that protection wore nothing but a leather apron. As sparks flew around his workshop, the specialized techniques required to create armor were physically devastating. Shaping breastplates involved hammering metal over specialized stakes in specific patterns hundreds of times, often in awkward positions that would eventually destroy the smith's shoulders and back. The demands on a blacksmith's time only made their work even harder. Medieval blacksmiths never really clocked out. The blacksmith was always on call for every broken gate, snapped wagon wheel, or damaged weapon in town. Their version of a weekend was being able to sleep between emergencies. If a farmer broke a plow during planting season, the blacksmith had to repair it immediately, even if it meant working through the night. The entire village's food supply might depend on it. So, sorry I missed your wedding. The miller's daughter broke a nail, and the nail she was using to fix the wheel. Well, it's an emergency. Military demands were even more urgent. Historical records describe smiths being forced to travel with troops to make field repairs during active sieges. Talk about workplace hazards. Most jobs don't include a chance of being shot with arrows in the job description. Even routine events like horse injuries required immediate attention. A horse with a thrown shoe couldn't work, and in an agricultural society, that meant financial loss. Blacksmiths were basically the medieval version of roadside assistants, except instead of helping you change a tire, they had to create the tire from scratch, and the horse would be giving them dirty looks. Religious holidays didn't provide any real break, while most trades respected holy days as times of rest. Blacksmiths were often exempted because their work was considered essential. Church records show special dispensations granted to smiths to work on holy days in cases of urgent necessity. The irony of this always-on-call existence was that, despite their essential role, blacksmiths rarely received appreciation proportionate to their sacrifice. Instead, they often faced consequences for things that were completely out of their control. If there had been medieval courtrooms, the blacksmith would have been the default scapegoat. When weapons broke or tools failed, it was the blacksmith who took the blame, regardless of how the item was misused. Despite this unfairness, they kept hammering away, shaping the backbone of society. It wasn't the farmer who misused the tool that would be blamed, but the smith who supposedly made it too weak. The burden of proof always fell on the blacksmith, with no modern quality control standards or written warranties. Disputes came down to reputation and social standing. When a wealthy merchant's carriage wheel broke because he overloaded it, who would the town magistrate believe? The prosperous merchant or the soot-covered smith? Yes, I'm sure your carriage wheel spontaneously disintegrated under the perfectly reasonable weight of 20 people and all their belongings. One fascinating detail comes from medieval court records. Blacksmiths were sometimes required to swear oaths on holy relics, assuring that they hadn't deliberately sabotaged their work. The mere existence of such requirements shows how quickly blame shifted to the smith when products failed. Even after their death, blacksmiths couldn't escape the weight of blame. Guild records mention smiths who, in their final confessions, felt compelled to ask for forgiveness for tools that had broken and potentially caused injuries. Even on their deathbeds, blacksmiths couldn't escape the burden of responsibility, taking the fall for mistakes that were often beyond their control. Children added another layer of complexity to the blacksmith's life. When a child was injured by a metal tool or object, parents would immediately blame the maker, rather than considering issues of supervision. Records from several medieval towns show that smiths were held liable for injuries caused by items they had crafted, even years after the sale. Weather damage also created a no-win situation. Metal gates rusted in the rain, farm tools corroded in damp soil, and armor exposed to the elements deteriorated without modern protective coatings. Some level of rust was inevitable, yet customers expected their metal goods to stay pristine indefinitely. Perhaps most frustrating was that blacksmiths often warned customers about proper care and usage, only to be ignored. A blacksmith might explicitly tell a farmer not to use a delicate pruning blade to chop firewood, only to be blamed when the blade inevitably broke under such misuse. Even on their deathbeds, some blacksmiths couldn't escape blame for things that weren't their fault. But despite all these hardships, medieval blacksmiths forged ahead, creating the metal backbone of society. Their legacy lives on today, in castle gates that still stand, in museum pieces that have survived for centuries, and in the trade itself, which evolved but never disappeared. Through fire, injury, blame, and exhaustion, they hammered out civilization, one piece at a time, leaving behind a history as strong as the metal they worked. And so, the blacksmiths of the Middle Ages may have lived hard, painful lives, but their contribution to society cannot be overstated. Without their work, the medieval world wouldn't have been able to function, and their influence continues to echo through history. In every piece of metalwork and every forge that continues to this day,